Alright, my name is Evelyn and I'm presenting on amateur boxing, protecting the most valuable tool, the hand. Brief overview, we know it's one of the oldest combat sports. The goal is to hit and not be hit. You've got to have a high amount of both technical and tactical skills, as well as physical and physiological fitness. Athletes compete in three-minute rounds with a 1-minute break. From the previous presentation I did, the hand's the most commonly affected injury site. The two most common injuries are boxer's knuckle and carpal metacarpal instability. A little bit of data here on the right. 4 years of data collected from the Great Britain Olympic team. We can see that the hand and the wrist are the most common injury site. Little picture here for you. That's boxer's knuckle on the left. You can see that subluxed tendon extensor, and on the right is that carpal metacarpal boss where instability occurs from force from a punch being transmitted through the hand. So looking at risk factors, so the mechanisms of injury is punching impact. Risk factors are, competition versus training. So you're 16 times more likely to get injured punching in competition compared to in training. So also based on that statistic, obviously the frequency of matches is also a risk factor. Training volume. So looking at the prevalence, there are more injuries sustained overall in training compared to competition. Age is another factor where the likelihood of injury actually has been shown to increase with age. As well as skill level, where elite level boxers can punch with extremely large impact forces compared to club level or more novice fighters. And lastly, previous hand injury has also been shown to be a risk factor. So what are some potential solutions that we can look at? So the first one being technique, then research, equipment, rule changes, and then lastly, data collection. So first of all, looking at technique. So the prevention of hand and wrist injuries in boxing is essential and can begin in the gym essentially with carefully supervised training and instruction. So looking at punch landing mechanics here on the left here, showing how punchers should punch. So making sure that that wrist is straight on impact and that we're landing on that second and third digit. So the execution of flawless, efficient, and potentially less injurious mechanisms of punching need to be mastered by the fighter while avoiding excessive punching. So on the coach's part, this might mean being creative when designing drills that reduce the impact on boxers' hands and wrists. So looking at research, which is the key piece, so the International Boxing Association, known as AIBA, essentially need to help provide funding for research. So research needs to be conducted on injury analysis, as well as equipment to help reduce injury rates and increase the safety of participants. 2 studies in particular, one needs to be conducted on gloves that are being used in competition, as well as another study looking at a comparison between gauze and tape, which is used in professional boxing, and cotton hand wraps, which are currently being used. Now, once this research has been conducted, there needs to be knowledge translation. It needs to be provided through open sources with the national boxing associations. From a boxing club and athlete perspective, they need to be encouraged to participate in these studies so that we can help generate some longitudinal injury statistics and product testing, which can help inform athletes' decision on safety and their equipment choice. So equipment that we're looking at is boxing gloves and hand wrapping. Looking at boxing gloves first here, 4 different images. Boxing gloves range from anywhere from $30 here on the left with these Everlast gloves, all the way up to $500+ with these winning gloves. The top left image is competition gloves that are approved by AIBA. They've got their little stamp here. And on the right is a pair of rival gloves. They use D30 technology, which is used in motorcycle protective gear and is claimed to reduce impact forces. So other options, that's no studies been shown to confirm that, but there is different technology out there. So in terms of choosing a glove, you want to find a glove that provides the most protection for your hand and wrist. That means that the glove fits properly so your hand's not swimming in it, that it secures your wrist, and that they also land properly on impact. And that's a big piece with the cheaper gloves. They hardly ever land where you should land, which is on that second and third digit. Hand wrapping, another big piece. So on the left here, these two images, Floyd Mayweather, but he's getting his hand wrapped. So most professionals use gauze and tape to wrap their hand. Obviously that's one-time use, but it does provide, you can see the amount of cushioning here over the knuckles and the stability on the wrist with all that tape. Top right here is traditional cotton hand wraps, which most amateur boxers used. And on the bottom right is a product called Radius Wrap, which is a foam insert that you can put inside the hand wraps, which has been proven by research to reduce impact forces. So again, we want to ensure that the athletes wrap and adequately secure the hand and the wrist. Use gauze and tape if possible. I've got a little star there because wrapping your hands with gauze and tape, it's a skill. Not a lot of people know how to do it properly. So at the very least, if boxers are using tape on top of their hand wraps, that should also stabilize the wrist more. So if we're using hand wraps, which most amateur boxers are, the type of hand wraps, so Mexican versus cotton hand wraps. Mexican hand wraps have a bit more stretch to them, so they'll form around the wrist a little bit better. You also want to consider the length of the hand wrap. Obviously, the longer the hand wrap means more turns that you can do around the wrist and the hand to stabilize that hand and wrist. And then lastly, using that foam insert over the knuckles is another option. So looking at rule changes, so AIBA taking their role in terms of providing safety for their fighters. So once that research is conducted on gloves, that research can help inform the glove selections that's actually used in competition, as well as for the hand wraps, potentially allowing amateur boxers to use tape on top of their hand wraps is also another thing that needs to be considered. And lastly, looking at competition restrictions. So as we know that a majority of injuries occur in competition, if we potentially reduce the number of competitions that athletes are allowed to compete in per season, that could also help protect their hands. Lastly, looking at data collection. So boxing clubs can collect data on injury in terms of type, location, and days lost. We can also collect data on volume and intensity, volume in terms of duration of training sessions. There's a product called HISCO, which also measures punch count. These little tiny inserts are put inside your hand wrap. That's some of the data that it collects up here, as well as intensity, so RPE. So with this data, we can calculate acute chronic workload ratio, monitor for trends and relationships, as well as for subsequent injury. We can collect data over time, which can then inform injury risk ranges, and most importantly, provide useful information on training load progression and changes in workload over time. So looking at some potential barriers to the solutions, the number one barrier would be buy-in, so both from the governing bodies, coaches, and athletes. I think the hardest part would probably be the research piece, which kind of feeds into all of the other solutions. Without getting that high quality research and getting that buy-in from AIBA, which is the governing body, it'll be really hard to implement change. So that's a big piece. Looking at boxing culture and tradition, all the solutions that I proposed, they're not affecting the sport, which is great. I mean, obviously the mechanism of injury is punching, so we can't really influence that. So that's a good thing there. Little small things in terms of, hand wraps and glove choice isn't that major. So as long as we can, get that buy-in from the athletes, explain to them the reasoning behind and how this will help prevent injury, that shouldn't be an issue. Looking in terms of resources, so more so on the end of both that research collection as well as data collection for sport coaches. So that'll probably be the hardest piece. I've only used data collection in terms of load management. I decided not to use wellness surveys, mainly because currently there's nothing really that boxers or boxing coaches are using in terms of collecting data, so I wouldn't want to overwhelm them. Wellness surveys would be something that I would want to use in the future though. So making sure that there's a team that can help, that knows how to use Excel sheets, that is good at collecting that data is key. And then the number one thing that we've learned from Finch is compliance. So making sure that everybody's staying on board, that they understand the reasoning behind why we're implementing these change, so that we have the buy-in and so we have that compliance. Those are my references. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Thanks, guys.